Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. Victor had always been a shadow in the world of magic, a name whispered in dark corners, someone you avoided talking about unless you wanted trouble. For years, he studied the forbidden arts of necromancy in secret, hiding behind a mask of respectability in the halls of wizardry. But all that changed when he found the Book of the Undead. It happened late one stormy night. The cathedral, where the ancient texts were stored, lay silent beneath the crackling thunder. Victor crept through its towering stone halls, his robes whispering against the cold marble floor. He'd be prepared for this moment for years, learning how to evade the holy wards that protected the vault where the book lay sealed. The sacred seals cracked, and with a surge of dark power, the ancient tome was hid. With the book in hand, Victor vanished into the night, leaving behind a trail of death and decay. Soon after, the dead began to rise in nearby villages. Corpses freshly buried clawed their way out of graves. Shadows moved unnaturally in the woods, and a dark cloud began to creep over the land. Arthur, a young paladin of the cathedral, stood in the doorway of his small village home, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His armor, though polished and well-maintained, felt heavier than usual. News of the dead rising had reached him only hours earlier. A sense of dread gnawed at his chest, but beneath it burned a fierce determination. "You were leaving?" Mary's soft voice was soft but firm as she stood behind him. She was a priestess of the light, her gentle demeanor masking the strength within her. Her long white robes shimmered faintly, as though infused with the very light she worshipped. Arthur nodded, turning to face her. "Victor has the Book of the Undead. He's raising an army of creatures that don't belong in this world. And you plan to stop him alone?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "That's not how the light works. We fight together." He couldn't help but smile. "I knew you'd do say that." The journey began at dawn. Arthur and Mary traveled across the once lush green fields that had begun to wither under the influence of necromantic magic. As they moved closer to the corrupted lands, they could feel the chill in the air. It wasn't just cold. There was something wrong, something unnatural. It felt like the very essence of life had been drained from the soil, the trees, and the creatures that once thrived here. They passed through a village that had once been bustling with activity. Now it lay silent, its homes abandoned, doors hanging open, and signs of struggle littering the ground. The stench of death clung to the air. They didn't even have a chance. Mary murmured, her hand tightening around her staff. Arthur's jaw clenched. "Victor did this. We have to find him before he raises more of these abominations." As they ventured deeper into the corrupted lands, the first of the undead appeared. The creatures moved slowly, their decaying bodies shuffling across the earth with a grotesque, uncoordinated motion. Their eyes, if they still had them, glowed with an eerie blue light, a sign of the necromancer in control. Arthur drew his sword, the blade shimmering with holy light. "Stay close," he said, positioning himself between Mary and the advancing undead. His sword slashed through the air, cutting down the first of the creatures with ease, the light from his weapon scorching the decayed flesh. Mary, chanting softly under her breath, raised her staff and summoned a protective barrier of light around them. The barrier shimmered, deflecting the slow, clumsy strikes of the undead there. "Some more coming," she warned. The ground beneath them began to tremble as more undead creatures rose from the earth. Skeletal hands clawed their way out of the ground, and from the shadows emerged twisted figures, long dead but animated by the dark magic of the Book of the Undead. Arthur fought valiantly, his blade cutting through the undead like a beacon of hope. But for everyone he struck down, two more seemed to rise in its place. His breathing grew heavy, and his arms began to ache from the constant swing. "We can try fight them all," Mary said urgently. "We need to move." Arthur nodded, slashing through another wave of undead before retreating toward her. "There's a temple ahead, an old place of worship. We'll find safety there." The two of them broke into a run, the undead shuffling after them with slow but relentless determination. They reached the temple just as the sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the landscape. The doors to the temple were half-rotted, hanging on rusted hinges. Inside, the place was as abandoned as the village, but there was a lingering sense of holiness that the undead seemed hesitant to cross. "We'll be safe here for the night," Arthur said, sheathing his sword. Mary placed her staff in front of the door, creating a ward to keep the undead at bay. "Victor says growing stronger by the day," she said, her voice low. If we don't, you find the Codex of Light soon. We won. To be able to stop him. Arthur sat down heavily on one of the pews, his head in his hand. I know, he said quietly, but we have no idea where it is. The legends speak of it, but no one's seen the Codex in centuries. Mary sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. We'll find it, she said. The light will guide us. The night passed uneasily, the sounds of the undead scraping at the temple walls echoing through the dark. Arthur slept fitfully, his dreams plagued by images of Victor, his twisted smile, the dead rising at his command. When dawn broke, they knew they couldn't linger. The next leg of their journey took them deeper into the heart of the corrupted land. The further they went, the more twisted the world became. Trees stood bare, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers toward the sky. The earth beneath their feet was dry and cracked, as if the life had been sucked out of it long ago. As they reached the ruins of an ancient temple, Arthur and Mary knew they were getting closer. The air was thick with dark magic, and a sense of foreboding hung over the place. This was no ordinary temple. The architecture was old, older than the cathedral where they'd begun their journey, and the carvings on the walls depicted scenes of light, battling darkness, warriors wielding weapons of pure energy, standing against creatures of shadow and bone. This must be it, Arthur said, his voice barely a whisper. The Codex of Light is here. Mary nodded, but her face was tense. Be careful, she said. If Victor knows we were close, he'll send his forces to stop us. They made their way cautiously through the ruins, their every step echoing off the stone wall. As they ventured deeper into the temple, the atmosphere grew heavier, the air almost suffocating. And then they saw a pedestal at the center of a grand hall, bathed in a beam of light from a hole in the ceiling. Atop the pedestal lay the Codex of Light, its pages glowing with a faint, holy radiance. Arthur approached it carefully, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the key to stopping Victor, to sealing the Book of the Undead once and for all. But as his fingers brushed the Codex, the ground shook and the air filled with a terrible screeching sound. The walls trembled, and from the shadows, a horde of undead creatures emerged, their eyes burning with unnatural light. They knew we were coming, Mary said, her voice tight with fear. Victor sent them to stop us. Arthur drew his sword, the light from the Codex giving him strength. We have what we need, he said. Now we just have to get out of here alive. The battle that followed was fierce. The undead attacked with a ferocity they hadn't shown before, as if they knew this was their last chance to stop Arthur and Mary from retrieving the Codex. Arthur's blade flashed in the dim light of the temple, cutting through the horde with renewed vigor, while Mary stood behind him, chanting prayers and calling down divine protection. Arthur's sword moved with a precision born of years of training, each strike fueled by the urgency of the moment. The undead pressed in from all sides, their decayed forms relentless and unfeeling. But as his blade cut through bone and rotten flesh, the light from the Codex seemed to imbue him with strength far beyond what he'd known before. His muscles burned with exertion, but his resolve was stronger than ever. Behind him, Mary's voice was steady, her prayers ringing out like a beacon in the darkness. The divine light she wielded was the only thing keeping the tide of undead at bay. Each time her staff hit the ground, a wave of holy energy erupted, scattering the creatures, buying them just enough time to regroup. But it wouldn't all last forever. The number of enemies seemed endless, and Victor's magic was growing stronger the closer they got to his lair. We need to move, Arthur shouted over the sound of clashing metal and the unearthly groans of the undead. He glanced back at Mary, whose face was set in grim determination. I am with you, she said, her voice breathless but resolute. Together, they pushed forward, carving a path through the writhing mass of undead. Arthur's sword cut a glowing arc through the air, each strike sending bursts of holy energy cascading outward. With the Codex of Light now secured under his arm, he could feel its power pulsing through him, guiding his strikes and bolstering his strength. The temple walls seemed to close in around them as they neared the exit. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the temperature had dropped so low that their breath misted in the cold. The undead surged one final time, desperate to prevent their escape. But Arthur's sword moved like a blur, cleaving through the creatures with righteous fury. With one last swing, the path ahead was clear. They burst out of the temple, the night sky above them swirling with dark clouds. The moon was obscured, casting the landscape in shadow, but Arthur could see the faint outline of the corrupted cathedral in the distance. That was where Victor waited, the book of the undead in hand, preparing for the final ritual that would unleash his full power. "You're close," Arthur said, panting as they ran across the barren landscape. "We have to stop him before the ritual is complete." Mary nodded, her face pale but determined. "I can feel the darkness growing stronger. We don't have much time." They pushed onward every step, bringing them closer to the heart of Victor's twisted power. The land around them seemed to wither beneath their feet, as though the very life had been drained from the earth. Strange, twisted shadows moved at the edges of their vision, but none dared come closer, not with the Codex of Light in their possession. As they approached the cathedral, the sky above them seemed to darken further, thick clouds swirling ominously, as bolts of dark energy crackled in the distance. The once holy structure now stood as a beacon of corruption, its towering spires twisted and blackened, and the air around it hummed with dark magic. They stopped at the cathedral's entrance, where the doors had long since rotted away, leaving only a yawning black void. From within, they could hear the rhythmic chanting of Victor Sallet's voice, his words twisted and ancient, laced with the power of necromancy. Arthur's grip on the codex tightened. "This is it," he said. "We have to end this now." Without another word, they entered the cathedral, the oppressive darkness inside seeming to swallow them whole. The once grand hall was now little more than a crumbling ruin, the walls covered in thick layers of dust and decay. At the far end of the hall, Victor stood before an altar, his back to them. The Book of the Undead lay open in front of him, glowing with a sickly green light as he recited the ancient incantation. "Victor Arthur," some voice echoed through the cathedral. The necromancer turned slowly, a cruel smile twisting his lip. His once handsome face was now gaunt and hollow, his eyes burning with an unnatural fire. Arthur," he said, his voice a low mocking drawl, "I was wondering when you would arrive." Arthur drew his sword, the Codex of Light glowing brightly in his other hand. "This ends now, Victor. The Codex will seal the Book of the Undead, and your reign of darkness will be over." Victor laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent chills down their spine. "You think you can stop me? The power of the undead is beyond your understanding. With this book, I will command armies that cannot be defeated. Even with the Codex, you are nothing." As he spoke, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. From the shadows, more undead began to emerge, their twisted forms crawling up from the very floor of the cathedral. Arthur's jaw tightened, but he did not waver. "Mary," he said softly, "it's Mary stepped forward, her staff glowing with divine light together. They raised the Codex of Light, and as they did, the room was bathed in a blinding radiance. The undead recoiled, hissing as the holy energy burned their decayed flesh. Victor snarled, raising his hands to summon more creatures, but Arthur was faster. With a surge of energy, he launched himself toward the altar, his sword cutting through the air with a brilliant flash. Victor barely had time to react before Arthur's blade sliced through the air, severing the necromancer's sun connection to the Book of the Undead. "No," Victor screamed, his voice filled with rage and fear. He stumbled back, his hands clutching the severed tendrils of dark magic that still lingered in the air. "You cannot defeat me." Arthur didn't respond. Instead, he thrust the Codex of Light forward, its power surging toward the Book of the Undead. The two artifacts collided in a brilliant explosion of light and shadow, and for a moment, the entire cathedral was bathed in a blinding glow. Victor screamed as the light enveloped him, his body disintegrating in the holy energy. The Book of the Undead trembled violently, its pages curling and blackening as the Codex sealed its power once and for all. The ground beneath them shook, and the air was filled with the sound of Victor's final, agonized scream. And then it was over. The cathedral fell silent, the oppressive darkness lifting as the light from the Codex slowly faded. The Book of the Undead lay closed on the altar, its once terrible power now sealed within, never to be unleashed again. Arthur stood there, breathing heavily, his sword lowered. Mary approached him, her hand gently resting on his shoulder. "It's done," she said softly. He nodded, but there was no triumph in his eyes, only relief. "Victor is gone," he said, "but the damage he did, it'll take time to heal." Mary smiled faintly. We've given the world that time. The light will guide them." They left the cathedral behind, the cursed book sealed and locked away in the depths of the earth where it could never again be used for evil. As they made their way back to the village, The sun began to rise, casting a warm golden light over the land that had once been dark and twisted. Arthur and Mary knew their journey wasn't truly over. There would always be darkness in the world, always evil that sought to corrupt the light. But as long as they stood together, as long as they wielded the power of the light, there would always be hope. And that was enough.